take a little break from that and actually celebrate the fact that our colleague at the Wall Street Journal, Evan Gershkovich, the American reporter jailed for spying after what could only be described as a show trial in Russia, has now landed in the United States after being freed in momentous prisoner swap that took place on Thursday. I'm joined now by Mark Saber, who's an international affairs consultant, but Mark's friend and former colleague on the Magnitsky campaign, Vladimir Kara-Murza, has also been released from Russian prison. Tell us more about that.
So Vladimir Kara-Murza was arrested and detained. He was an opposition leader. He used to work with Boris Nemtsov, who famously was shot dead outside the Kremlin in 2015 on the day that all the cameras were broken for cleaning, or they were all facing the wrong way that day. And he was then poisoned twice. And he went back, despite all of us saying, don't go back, they clearly don't want you there. And he said, I cannot abandon my country and my people. Democracy must come to Russia. And he went back to teach people about participating in local elections, to encourage people to stand. And eventually he was arrested and detained and sent to a gulag. And his health diminished, and we were getting extremely worried about his state of health. We didn't think he was coming out, to be honest. And although a huge campaign was launched by many of his former colleagues around the world, because of course he'd become well known around the world as a Russian opposition leader, we couldn't seem to crack what we could do to get him out. But the efforts of hostage negotiators from the US, from Canada, in the EU, from Bill Browder, the leader of the Magnitsky campaign, and others, obviously proved successful to an extent. So the downside is that we have these 16 people who've been released. The downside is that Putin is going to continue taking hostages. Yeah. And he's now seen that he can get rid of 16 good people, because if you look at the 16 people who were released, who were they? Journalists, people who worked for Alexei Navalny, who was just killed in February or died in a gulag. You have journalists, you have political activists, you have business people, and in return you get killers and spies and people involved in nefarious acts in the West. That's who Putin wants back. This isn't really a prisoner swap. It's, I want the bad guys back, and I'm going to give you soft targets.
This is a sort of chess game, frankly speaking, in which innocent people on our side have been unwitting pawns. We have a clip, actually. Let's have a look at this, of Vladimir's family speaking to him on the phone for the first time since he was freed. They were all in the Oval Office. I think my understanding is all the prisoners were, released prisoners were on a plane coming back and all got their moment to be able to speak to their families. Let's have a watch.
No one is strong enough for this. I was sure I'm going to die in prison. I don't believe what's happening. I still think I'm sleeping in my prison cell in Omsk instead of hearing your voice. But I just want you to know that you've done a wonderful thing by saving so many people. I think there were 16 of us on the plane. Again, I still can't believe it's happening. So I just want you to say that I don't think there are many things more important than saving human lives.
There's no greater job I have than protecting Americans and bringing Americans who are wrongfully held home. I really mean it.
I mean, extremely emotional scenes there. And, what's amazing, actually, is the mettle and the dignity of these people who have been released, who are just very calm, very reassured. But, I mean, do you think that you spoke about Vladimir being in a gulag and his health massively deteriorating? It seems to me, from what we can observe already from Evan Gershkovich, is people have said that he looks very pale, probably hasn't seen sunlight for a very long time, but otherwise, in okay condition. Do the Russians treat these people really badly, by and large?
I would say that you'd rather be in a British prison than in a Russian prison, certainly. We know how many Russian prisoners die. The numbers are off the chart. In the case of Sergei Magnitsky, the lawyer who was killed, he was the lawyer for the group that I worked with originally. He was put in prison cells where they would remove the windows in winter. He was put in prison cells where there was no sewage. So whatever you would do to evacuate yourself would then come back up onto your prison floor. Disease was rife. You were not treated properly. If you had medical conditions, it was weaponized against you. So he was asked to sign guilty pleas, or he wouldn't get medical treatment. That's how they behave there. And who are you going to complain to? There is no sort of ombudsman for the treatment of prisoners in Russia. So his deteriorating health was genuinely concerning. It was a touch and go that whether we would ever see him again. In fact, he says that in his phone call with President Biden. And I think that the other thing that's very important is the Americans did not give up, that they would find a way to get their people out. They did not give up. They worked tirelessly for that to happen. And they had to convince the governments of Norway, Germany, Slovenia, Turkey and others to work in conjunction with them to make this exchange happen. If I may, it's notable that the UK was left out. And we have to remember that Vladimir Kara-Murza is a British citizen. He's been protected by the Americans because his wife and children are American, but he's British.
Why was the UK left out in all of this? So there are sort of concerns that in times past, particularly when it comes to Russian money, that we may have turned a blind eye to some of this, the behaviour of the oligarchs and Putin's gangster kleptocracy.
That's exactly 100% correct. If you go back to 2009, the leadership that we had then was all about the golden era with China and a reset with Russia. We had Obama in America in 2008 actually having a policy called the reset. And then we had our own leadership here wanting the same thing. So oligarchs were coming in and buying football clubs, hotels, restaurant chains and so on, investing in art museums and art buildings and so on. And we celebrated all of that, despite the warnings of a group like ours saying, you're not asking who these people are and where is the money coming from. And so we suddenly found ourselves in this position where we have to untangle ourselves from all this dirty money and all these dirty people. And so when a war with Ukraine happens, we're suddenly in a rush to sanction everybody. We're in a rush to ban everybody. And of course, that's not necessarily the smartest way of dealing with it.
Well, very, very difficult to actually do. Let's listen now to new audio that's been released of Evan Gershkovich. He's speaking after he got off the plane in Maryland. We can play that now.
It was great to get on that bus today and see a lot of, you know, not just Americans and Germans, but Russian political prisoners. But I just spent a month in prison in Yekaterinburg where there's a whole, you know, basically everybody I sat with is a political prisoner, and nobody knows them publicly. They have, you know, various political beliefs, so they're not all connected with Navalny supporters, which I think, you know, everybody knows about them. And so today was a really touching moment to see all of them, but it would be, you know, I think good to see if we could potentially do something about them as well. And I'd like to talk to people about that in the next weeks and months. Anyway, it's good to see you. Welcome home.
Evan, how are you feeling?
I'm all right. It was a good flight.
I'm all right. It was a good flight. But he says there, you know, now the interesting thing about someone like Evan Gershkovich is he will become a bit of a pin-up in some respects of being able to shine a light more on the Russian regime. Now, your colleague in the Magnitsky campaign, Bill Browder, has said that perhaps the West now needs to start treating Russia a bit like North Korea and just stop sending people there to stop this from being able to happen. Is that the direction of travel we should go down?
Well, I think that the government's advisory to people moving to or investing in those countries should be changed from it being a risk to being, if you go there, we cannot help you. And the same should be for China, who, by the way, hold hostages as well, a lot of them. In fact, in Hong Kong, there is a British citizen called Jimmy Lai, who's being held hostage for the last 3.5 years. And the British government is not doing much to help him either. He's a British citizen. And we're having the same challenges we had with the Russians in dealing with the Chinese. They hold people hostage, they demand things in return, they demand leniency for other issues that they take part in. And we should be making an absolute scandal of that. And one of the ways of doing that is by saying, if you go to Russia, we cannot help you.
No insurance policy. You've got to go to Brexit, but Tim, quickly,
Well, look, I have no quarrel with what's just been said, but this, of course, is part of also what Russia and China ultimately want. They want their countries to live in darkness. They don't want what goes on inside their countries to be reported by anyone. So, in a way, they win either way in this. They have no journalistic scrutiny of their despotic behaviour, or they have potential pawns with which to play with in these future hostage negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, there's a far bigger conversation. You know, like you're talking about 2009 and the failure of governments to stop letting in Russian oligarchs. There's a big question to be asked about whether we should be buying solar panels and windfarms and EVs from China, as well as we did buying gas from Putin. We're going to take a short break now. Thank you ever so much, Mark, for coming into the studio.